The stench of rotting flesh permeated the gilded chambers of Versailles on an August morning in 1715. This wasn't the decay of an ordinary corpse, it was the still living body of the man who once declared himself a god on earth. Louis XIV, the Sun King, lay in a crimson silk bed as maggots literally devoured his gangrenous leg. But what most horrified the courtiers wasn't the sight of the absolute monarch's physical disintegration. It was the fact that, even with death knocking at his door, he continued to demand that everyone bow before his decaying presence, insisting that his agony be transformed into a public spectacle. The megalomania that had built the most powerful kingdom in Europe had become his own tomb. This wasn't just a king dying. It was the implosion of a mind that had spent decades constructing an alternate reality where he was the center of the universe, where every breath of his subjects should be a tribute to his greatness. What historical records have attempted to mask for centuries, medical reports and private letters from courtiers reveal in disturbing detail. Louis XIV wasn't just an autocratic monarch. He was a pathological narcissist whose mental disorders shaped not only France, but all of Europe, leaving a trail of psychological devastation that extended far beyond the borders of his kingdom. When Louis ascended the throne at age 4 in 1643 after his father's death, he didn't just inherit a crown. He inherited a fragmented France threatened by internal revolts and surrounded by external enemies. But he also inherited something more sinister. A mother, Anne of Austria, who had been psychologically devastated by her husband's premature death, and who projected all her messianic expectations onto her young son. Early accounts from his tutors describe a boy who didn't play with ordinary toys. He played with armies of lead soldiers, arranging them in complex military formations while shouting orders as if commanding real troops. At age 5, he already displayed worrying signs of dissociation from reality, creating elaborate ceremonies where he forced other boys of the court to bow before him, not playfully, but with disturbing seriousness. What few know is that Louis XIV kept a secret diary where he recorded not only political events, but his own emotional and physical reactions to the adoration he received. Passages discovered in the royal archives reveal a deeply disturbed mind. Today, when I entered the chapel, I saw the fear and reverence in the courtiers' eyes. I felt a sensation of warmth coursing through my body, as if absorbing their life force. God made me for this. I am not just king. I am the channel through which God rules France. These words, written in 1661, reveal a man who not only believed in his divinity, but who experienced physical pleasure from the submission of others. The daily routine at Versailles was structured like a continuous narcissistic drug. From the moment he awoke until he slept, Louis was constantly surrounded by people who existed solely to confirm his greatness. His personal physicians, in confidential reports, described symptoms we now recognize as signs of pathological admiration dependence. When deprived of attention for more than a few hours, he developed intense headaches, excessive sweating, and episodes of uncontrolled rage. One physician wrote in 1668, "His Majesty appears physically ill when he is not the center of attention. I recommend he never be left alone for more than 2 hours." The most disturbing aspect of Louis XIV's narcissism was how he weaponized the emotional dependence of others. He didn't just want adoration, he wanted people to be unable to adore him. The complex etiquette of Versailles was designed to create psychological dependence. Nobles who were once independent in their domains were gradually turned into courtiers addicted to royal approval. The Duke of Orleans, in private letters, described how the king's presence became a drug I cannot shake. Even when I hate him, I need him. Even when I see his cruelty, I beg for his attention. This wasn't just politics, it was psychological engineering. Louis XIV instinctively understood that the best way to control people wasn't through fear, but through emotional dependence. He created a system where being ignored by him was psychologically more painful than being punished by him. Courtiers competed not just for favors, but for the king's very attention, transforming the court into a psychological arena where the king's approval was literally more valuable than gold. The consequences of this pathological dynamic extended far beyond Versailles. The whole of France began to function as an extension of the king's narcissistic psyche. Entire cities were redesigned to create perspectives culminating in statues of him. Laws were created not based on justice, but on how they could glorify his reign. The French economy was structured to fund not just the government, but the king's insatiable need to be magnified. The result was an entire nation functioning as a support system for a single hypertrophied ego. If you're noticing familiar patterns in this narrative, if you're recognizing dynamics you observe in contemporary politics or modern leaders, subscribe to our channel. We continue exploring how the mental disorders of historical figures shaped our civilization in ways we rarely fully understand. What makes Louis XIV's case particularly chilling is how his pathology manifested in warfare. He didn't wage wars just for territory or resources. He waged wars because military conflicts were the biggest possible stage for his greatness. The War of the Grand Alliance wasn't fought for coherent strategic reasons. It was fought because Louis needed the drama of being a warrior king. Hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen died not defending France, but feeding the narcissistic fantasy of a man who confused his personal desires with national needs. His generals, in private correspondence, described strategic meetings where Louis didn't discuss military tactics, but scenarios where he could appear heroic. Marshal Turenne wrote, "His Majesty seems more interested in how history will remember this battle than in how to win it." French soldiers were sent to die in formations that were aesthetically impressive but militarily suicidal, because Louis wanted his victories to be visually magnificent for the artists who would immortalize them. The construction of Versailles, often romanticized as a symbol of French grandeur, reveals itself under this perspective as something far more sinister, a psychiatric asylum designed for a single patient. The palace cost approximately 25% of France's annual budget for decades, not because it was necessary for governance, but because Louis needed a physical setting that matched his grandiose self-perception. Thousands of workers died during construction, not from unavoidable accidents, but because Louis demanded that work continue regardless of weather, season, or safety conditions. His need to see the palace completed was more important than the human lives required to build it. The most disturbing aspect of Louis XIV's pathology emerges when we examine his personal relationships. He didn't have friends, he had adoration suppliers. He didn't have lovers, he had objects that confirmed his irresistibility. His relationships with women were particularly revealing. He treated them as living trophies, collecting them not for affection or passion, but as evidence of his own magnificence. Madame de Montespan, his most famous mistress, described in confidential letters how he made love as if he were being observed by an invisible crowd, as if even his intimate moments were performances for an imaginary audience. Marie-Thérèse, his wife, suffered decades of psychological humiliation not because Louis was unfaithful, but because he was incapable of seeing her as a person. To him, she was merely a dynastic object, a piece of royal porcelain that existed to validate his importance. When she died in 1683, Louis didn't display genuine grief. He displayed irritation because her death temporarily interrupted the flow of attention he received. Courtiers reported that he seemed more concerned with how his widowhood would make him appear to others than with the loss of his life partner. His children suffered perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Louis didn't see them as independent human beings, but as extensions of himself. The Grand Dauphin, his heir, developed a completely passive personality, incapable of making independent decisions because he had been conditioned from childhood to exist only as a reflection of his father. Letters from the prince reveal a psychologically devastated man. "I don't know who I am when I'm not in the king's presence. I seem to exist only when he looks at me. When I'm alone, I feel like I disappear." The court of Versailles became a psychological laboratory where Louis XIV experimented with manipulative techniques we now recognize as forms of systemic narcissistic abuse. He fostered artificial rivalries among courtiers not out of political necessity, but because the resulting drama placed him at the center of attention. Entire families were destroyed by the king's orchestrated psychological games, which he watched unfold as personal entertainment. The Marquis de Dangeau, a shrewd observer of the court, recorded in his diaries, "The king seems to feed on the suffering of others, not cruelly, but far more frighteningly, as if the emotional drama surrounding him were necessary for his psychological survival. He creates conflict not out of malice, but because he needs to be at the eye of every emotional storm." This pathological need for drama explained his religion with religion. Louis wasn't genuinely religious. His religiosity was narcissistic. His faith was entirely self-centered. God existed to validate his greatness, not to be worshipped. When he revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, expelling Protestants from France, it wasn't out of theological conviction, but because he needed a dramatic demonstration of his absolute power. Hundreds of thousands of French Protestants fled the country, taking with them knowledge, skills, and wealth that permanently weakened France. But Louis was psychologically incapable of seeing beyond his own need to demonstrate divine authority. What makes this episode particularly revealing is how he reacted to the economic consequences of the expulsion of the Protestants. When ministers attempted to explain the economic damage, Louis showed no interest in the facts, but became irritated because they were suggesting his decision had been wrong. To a narcissistic mind, the possibility of error is psychologically intolerable. It's easier to ignore reality than to admit imperfection. His ministers developed elaborate techniques for communicating bad news without directly challenging his grandiose self-perception. The Minister of Finance, in private letters, described how he had to translate economic reports into a language that wouldn't bruise the royal ego. "I cannot say we are bankrupt. I must say that our enemies have forced us into heroic expenditures. I cannot say his decisions were incorrect. I must say that unforeseen circumstances interfered with his brilliant plans." This dynamic created a functionally delusional government. Political decisions were made not based on reality, but on how they could be presented to keep the king's self-perception intact. France gradually lost touch with reality, governed by reports filtered through the need to protect the psychological fragility of a single man. The most chilling aspect of Louis XIV's narcissism was his ability to infect others with his pathology. Versailles functioned like a psychological virus, infecting visitors with the need to magnify the king. Foreign diplomats, initially skeptical, often left royal audiences convinced they had encountered a semi-divine being. This wasn't normal charisma. It was a form of psychological contagion where the force of the king's narcissistic conviction temporarily overwhelmed the perceptual reality of others. The Duchess of Orleans, a pragmatic German, initially resistant to the royal cult, wrote after a year at Versailles, "I'm beginning to believe that perhaps he truly is different from other men. I cannot explain otherwise why I feel this need to please him, even when I know he is wrong. It's as if his conviction of being special is stronger than my certainty that he is not." This ability to alter the perception of reality in others created an entire kingdom operating under a kind of mass hypnosis. It wasn't just fear that kept people submissive. It was a genuine alteration of perception, where the king's illusory greatness temporarily became real for those in his presence. The consequences of this dynamic manifested most dramatically during the final years of his reign. As Louis aged, his need for external validation intensified exponentially. He began demanding increasingly elaborate ceremonies, not because they were necessary for governance, but because he needed escalating doses of adoration to maintain his psychological sanity. Versailles Protocol became so complex that courtiers spent hours preparing for minutes-long encounters, not for governmental efficiency, but to feed the king's narcissistic hunger. During the War of the Spanish Succession, when France was literally bankrupt and French soldiers were starving, Louis insisted on maintaining the luxury of Versailles unchanged. When ministers suggested cuts to palace spending, he responded with a phrase that perfectly sums up his pathology: "France may starve, but the king cannot appear poor." To him, the appearance of greatness was more important than national survival. His final years were marked by a disturbing intensification of all his narcissistic symptoms. As his body aged, his mind became even more dependent on external validation. He began demanding that physicians publicly confirm that his health was miraculous for his age, not because it was true, but because he needed even his physical decline to be perceived as exceptional. The most revealing episode of his pathology occurred in 1714, when gangrene began to consume his leg. Physicians recommended amputation, but Louis refused, not out of fear of surgery, but because a god cannot be mutilated. He preferred to die with his body intact than to live with a physical imperfection that contradicted his divine self-perception. For weeks he endured agonizing pain, not out of heroism, but because admitting he needed amputation would be admitting he was no different from other men. The final months of Louis XIV's life were a grotesque spectacle where his need for adoration literally became stronger than his survival instinct. Even as the gangrene spread, he continued demanding public audiences where courtiers were forced to watch his physical decomposition while pretending they still saw divinity instead of mortality. The Duke of Saint-Simon recorded one of the most disturbing scenes in royal history. The king, with his leg black and foul-smelling, continued to receive courtiers who were forced to bow before the stench of death. He seemed to derive pleasure from his own agony, as if even his death were a performance for a captivated audience. During his final weeks, Louis developed an obsession with his funeral and how he would be remembered. He dictated detailed instructions on how his body should be presented, how the courtiers should react to his death, and even which facial expressions would be appropriate during mourning. Even in death, he wanted to control the emotional reactions of others. When he finally died on September 1, 1715, after 72 years of life and 54 years of reign, his last words were, "I depart, but the state remains." But this wasn't a statesmanlike declaration. It was the final narcissistic fantasy of a man who, to the very end, couldn't distinguish between himself and France. The reaction to his death revealed the true psychological state of the nation he had ruled. Instead of genuine mourning, there was a kind of collective awakening, as if a spell had been broken. People who had spent decades worshipping him suddenly wondered why. The funeral itself was a bizarre event where courtiers who had lived entirely for his approval suddenly didn't know how to behave without his dominating presence. What Louis XIV left to France wasn't lasting greatness, but a psychologically traumatized nation. The political system he created, where everything depended on the will of a single man, collapsed immediately after his death. His successors, conditioned to be extensions of his personality, were incapable of governing independently. France took decades to recover, not only economically, but psychologically from his reign. His true legacy wasn't military conquests or architectural monuments, but a chilling demonstration of how a single mental disorder can warp an entire civilization. Louis XIV's absolutism wasn't simply an authoritarian political system. It was the collective manifestation of an individual pathology that managed to replicate itself throughout an entire society. What is perhaps most disturbing is how his model of narcissistic power became a template for future tyrants. The technique of creating psychological dependence instead of simply imposing fear, of weaponizing the human need for adoration and belonging, of transforming government into psychological theater, all these strategies can be traced back to Versailles. When we look at Louis XIV not through the romanticized lens of royal grandeur, but through the perspective of modern psychology, we see something far more haunting than an autocratic king. We see a case study of how untreated mental disorders can amplify through power until they become historical forces that shape the destinies of entire nations. The real tragedy wasn't just that Louis XIV was a pathological narcissist, but that he lived in a time and position where that pathology could manifest itself on a civilizational scale. His personal need for adoration became the political organization of an empire. His inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality became the basis of French foreign policy. His insatiable emotional hunger became the economic force that drained the wealth of a nation. The Sun King wasn't the symbol of French greatness. He was the symbol of how greatness can be an illusion built on the bones of generations who sacrificed everything to feed the psychological hunger of a single man. His light wasn't the light of the sun, but the feverish glow of a mind that could never accept its own humanity. Versailles remains to this day not as a monument to royal power, but as an architectural reminder that history's greatest monstrosities often dress themselves in the garments of magnificence. And perhaps the most haunting lesson of all is that even knowing this, we are still capable of being seduced by the same illusion that destroyed Louis XIV's France. The belief that some men are different from others, that some people deserve adoration, that performative grandeur can substitute for genuine humanity. The true horror of Louis XIV wasn't in his cruelty, but in his ability to make his pathology seem divine. And it is that ability to transform mental disorder into a system of government, to make sickness seem like health, to convert destruction into spectacle, that makes his story not just a historical account, but a warning about the eternal dangers that reside in the depths of the human psyche when amplified by absolute power.